people first, me first in terms of vaccines, and how developed countries have hoarded vaccines, how even in the United States, in all 50 states, if you're African American, you are disproportionately unlikely to get access to a vaccine in your state, and how the rollout of vaccines, both in the U.S. and in other places, is really putting Black to the back, and putting communities of color in the United States and people all around the world at risk of acquiring and developing symptomatic and severe COVID, while many of us, particularly in the global north, will soon be vaccinated and feel freer than we have in months and months and months. And then we're going to pivot towards the end and talk about what we need from our leaders. And I'll talk about President Biden, and Fatima will talk about Cyril Ramaphosa. But you know, it's the old thing: what do we want and when do we want it? We'll talk about the TRIPS waiver coming up, the discussions at the WTO, testing and global genomic surveillance for the variants, transparency in clinical trial data and decisions on vaccine selection, how are we triaging vaccines across the world, on what basis, and who's making these decisions. Talking about why Kovacs has been so insufficient to meet the current moment, and think about another public health global compact. You know, for all of us, this is not our first time at the rodeo. You know, we've seen HIV, we've seen TB, we've seen hepatitis C. Now we see COVID-19, and we've got to think about how we can sort of build a new public health compact for the world, so we don't end up going through this every time a new infectious disease threat sweeps across the globe. And so, yeah, I want to open up for discussion. What we'd like to do at the end is try to get people to go onto social media and to start amplifying the need for people's vaccine. I don't know if it's broken through the chatter across the world in the sort of multiverse media environment that we're basically going to have only a small portion of the planet vaccinated by the end of this year. So we'd like to start, there's ongoing campaigns, but we'd like to use CROI rather than have CROI use us, and get out the word on a people's vaccine today's during the conference, and use our platform to recruit scientists to that campaign, to see the scientists and researchers at CROI as allies to us, the way some of them were in the fight for access to antiretroviral therapy. But you know, as Simon and others who've been around for many, many years knows, scientists and clinicians are deeply important to us all throughout the course of the history of the epidemic. So when we have a conversation about how we can maybe boost the campaign for a people's vaccine, what else needs to be done, Fatima are going to be in conversation. We're not using slides, so anything you say might end up in the talk in about an hour. So you know, feel free to just sort of weigh in and say what you think.
Greg, do you all have some hashtags that you're using?
Yeah, we do. One is vaccine equity, except there's only one E. So it's VACCIN with a capital EQUITY.
Okay.
No hashtag no vaccine apartheid. And for those of you in the US, or whoever knows what it is, hashtag BLM, Black Lives Matter. So those are the ones we're going to use, but feel free to add others. I did some tweeting earlier this morning about the talk, but we really want to get out the word and try to, you know, at least in the US, the first 100 days of a presidential administration are where new things can happen. And so we really want to sort of amp this up, both in the US and abroad, both in donor countries, and in countries who desperately need these vaccines and are unlikely to get them in 2021 or even in 2022.
Thanks, Greg. Do folks have comments or questions or ideas that you'd like to share with Greg that may end up in the plenary this morning or afternoon?
I'm gonna take notes too. So.
And it looks like we have pretty much every continent on the planet represented here. So we have partners in Asia and Africa, Europe, the Americas.
I mean, if you also have information on what's happening in your country, like has anybody gotten vaccines? Is anybody likely to get vaccines? Would be helpful.
Dawn, please.
Hey there, Greg. I'm thrilled that you're going to start off the meeting this way. I think that it's the perfect way to do a Martin Delaney lecture. And I wonder if beyond kind of generally speaking, we want vaccines for everyone and we really want to create a people's vaccine. Can you kind of highlight any specific tangible steps that we actually have to take so that when we're talking about this, we're really not just talking in like general terms about what it is we hope to have happen?
Okay, so yeah, so one is the TRIPS waiver. Fatima is very, and I'm concerned about this as well, to support the TRIPS waiver. Director General of the WHO, Tedros, has said that we need to sort of obviate some intellectual property rights in order to speed the access to vaccines, but also, you know, there's been a lot of talk about how we don't have capacity to scale up vaccines at the current moment, and as if current capacity is a reflection of the future. People like the gang at Prep for All, but also now former CDC Director Thomas Frieden in the US have said we need to scale up mRNA vaccines for global production and distribution. I think the other piece that we'd like to call for is some sort of global convening to help us think about what's our purpose in vaccination. You know, is it disease mitigation? Is it to bring R naught under 1 in most countries around the world? What is our goal of vaccination in the current context? How do we intend to get there, both operationally, scientifically? And so it's not clear that those discussions are happening. You know, it sounds like people are trying to make these agreements with different companies to see how much they could get and put into the sort of global vaccine pot. But is there some sort of rational discussion about which vaccines where, how we're going to scale up for the production of vaccines for new variants? Again, the issue of sort of global genomic surveillance to understand when these variants emerge, when they do, and what kind of threats they hold. Yeah, I also, Simon is saying here, normal travel can't reopen without universal global vaccine access at the same time. Yeah, so all these things are true. So get the intellectual property barriers out of the way, and they're not the same for vaccines as they are for drugs. Everybody knows this. Yes, vaccine production is not the same as simple single molecule drugs, right? Everybody knows this, but it's not impossible to think about how we could build new facilities over the next 6 to 12, 18 months to scale up vaccines, including mRNA vaccines. Global surveillance for new variants, and also some strategic thinking about how we're going to sort of stage our vaccine rollout across the globe, not just in the US. And it better be a better one than we've done locally, domestically in the US. How are we going to do that in a way that's not just about worrying about the largesse of the companies and who will be willing to put money into the Kovacs pot? How are we going to do this at a scale that we haven't done or even conceived of to date?
Are you going to, I don't think you are, but I'm still very perplexed about anti-vaxxers. And I don't know if that's an American thing or Europe or whatever it is. It's very perplexing, but it kind of plays into everything. You're not going to cover anything like that, are you?
You know, we're not going to cover the sort of vaccine hesitancy. You know, it's interesting in the US context. Yes, there's vaccine hesitancy. There's a history of suspicion of the biomedical research establishment, et cetera. But the big problem in the US right now is access and the way we've set up rollout in the US. You know, in my state alone of Connecticut, if you're in frankly, a rich white town and you're elderly, 70% of you or more are likely to have been vaccinated, while in a poor city like Waterbury or Bridgeport, which is about 30 minutes from me, less than 30% of elderly Americans have gotten access to the vaccine. So right now, access is the key message we'd like to make. I think vaccine hesitancy is important, but right now, given what Kovacs has said they're going to do for the world, what the international commitments have been, the first order priority is scaling up and getting support for vaccination across the globe.
Emily, I see your hand.
Emily.
And that is all you're seeing. I
I
mean,
know. Where's the
Dawn
rest of
Everett
you?
with her gorgeous airy space and Greg with his like pro background. No way. Hello from my kitchen. You can imagine it. I'm really glad you're doing this. What are you going to say? And what do you think a global compact, a new global compact should look like?
Well, I mean, first of all, we've talked about this in the context of HIV and TB and hepatitis C, about really sort of enshrining some of the sort of commitments to access that we've talked about for now 20 years. You know, it's interesting. I was talking to a reporter a few weeks ago, and you know, none of them knew about some of these access provisions in Gates Foundation grant agreements and other kinds of sort of philanthropy that we've done over the course of the 20 years, where access is not just an afterthought, it's a given, and it's written into the documentation of what we do. So we shouldn't be developing medical products for rich countries without some provision for how to think about enshrining global access. You know, the other thing is global public health systems around the world are in pretty terrible shape, both from the US across the board. And, you know, one thing that COVID-19 has done is underscored the sort of lack of preparedness we have for fundamental health threats, not just from like COVID-19 and HIV, but think about global climate change. And so these are, we'll probably talk more about the specific vaccine scale up. I've talked a little bit and written with my colleague Amy Kopczynski here at Yale about a new deal for public health in the United States, because we spend only 3% of our healthcare dollar on health. We've lost 60,000 public health jobs since the recession in 2008, which never came back. All the places that are hard hit from COVID in the US, except for ones that sort of had the accident of early importation, are places that have been suffering from poor health and poor health outcomes for years based on our own sort of histories and political preferences in the US. And so the new Compact for Public Health, I'll probably talk about it in a domestic sense, and I think Fatima will talk about it more in a global sense.
So I'm
So
gonna
less on the, sorry, am I allowed to follow up?
Yeah, you're allowed to follow up.
Thank you, moderator. So, because I am curious and would love to continue a conversation, that the access in the compact around securing the commodities is so key, and also the financing mechanisms for getting them into programs and health system resilience is a whole other piece that it's interesting to see how the Global Fund is being seen and sort of used as a conduit for resources in the stimulus bill. And I guess that's the other piece of it that I'm really grappling with. And I'm curious if you or anybody else is really thinking through what that funding mechanism looks like and needs to be sort of charged to do.
Emily, honestly, no, I haven't thought about the Global Fund very much. We're focused this morning mostly on vaccine production and the moral and scientific imperative to get vaccines out there. I think the larger structural issues that you're talking about, I haven't thought about them very much right now, but you know, they've been on the table for a long time about the Global Fund leading to universal health care and these larger sort of emphasis on global health broadly written that have sort of emerged over the past 20 years. We've never put really any of our money where our mouth is about this, and we're seeing the sort of effects of that now.
Thanks, Greg. So there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to bring forward around production, and then Mitchell, I definitely see your hand. So first is Liz Heileman says, several countries seem to have ordered more than enough vaccine to cover their population, some multiple times over. Are there efforts to get them to commit extra to Kovacs?
Well, people should fill in because, you know, I know our neighbor to the north, Canada, which, you know, sorry, I mean, I really, you know, I never like to pick on Canada because they do everything much better than we do in terms of health, usually. But they've ordered, I don't know, 3 or 4 times as much vaccine as they need, including some doses from Kovacs. I don't know who else is sort of skimming off global procurement mechanisms to do this. But clearly, Kovacs has said they have capacity to do I think Simon is saying here a two-tier of health workers and basically 80% are not going to be covered over the next year. That there's some idea that it's between 20 and 27% of 98 countries in the global south will have access through Kovacs if everything goes right by the end of the year or shortly afterwards. And so I don't know what the commitments are from all of the countries for funding for Kovacs, but it's clearly not enough, and we clearly don't have enough global supply to make it happen.
So speaking of Kovacs, there's a question in here asking, they would love to hear what you have learned from the Kovacs processes over the past year and what should be done to improve this moving forward.
So the point is that the aspirations of so when we were thinking about scale up to antiretroviral therapy, there were early moves to say, like, we could do a little bit symbolically in the global south in the late 90s, early 2000s. If it wasn't for activists, we wouldn't have thought about universal access to treatment, or even something earlier than that, the 3x5 initiative. And Kovacs is basically saying we're doing what we can with what we have and the amount we've given. And Seth Berkley from Gavi and Kovacs has not been amenable to hearing that he needs to do more, and that he needs to turn towards his donors and ask them to do more. Seth and Kovacs should be coming online with Tom Frieden and others who are saying we need to figure out a global scale up and supply chain strategy now, and not just sort of say, we'll do what we can with what we have when we have it.
I'm going to take one more question from the chat, and then we're going to go to Mitchell. And this is another question from Thailand. So yay, Thailand. And this is from Udam. Suppose one country decides to use compulsory licensing, but it doesn't have a vaccine factory or capacity to build a vaccine. How do you think the country can move forward?
This is the thing, right? This is not HIV drug manufacture. It's not generic drugs. These are highly complex biologics. And we're going to have to get Moderna and Pfizer and others to say, we're going to do tech transfer, right? And we're going to do tech transfer to countries who can scale up, not just for their own populations, but for their regions, for instance. It's interesting, Merck is now going to help to make the J&J vaccine in the United States. It's not the same platform as the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, but it's clearly an unusual arrangement. And we need more unusual arrangements in terms of tech transfer. It's not just, so like the WTO waiver, the compulsory licensing, all great. What's greater is to get the tech transfer we need so that facilities in the global south and elsewhere can scale up production of these vaccines. I don't like to say nice things about President Trump, but he put a shitload of money into Moderna and these other companies to get these vaccines going. Part of them are not owned by Moderna, but they're owned by the American people. And so we have a public interest in getting these companies to do the right thing, and using whatever means necessary under American law and international trade agreements to make it happen.
Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to go to Mitchell verbally.
Thank you, Jim and Greg. And part of my question, actually, I think, Greg, you actually already addressed in responding to Nichia's about Kovacs. I do want to thank Jim and Dawn and Ntando, who's not on the line, as the Community Liaison Committee to get the Delaney lecture squarely in the opening. So thanks to you all. But Greg, I wondered a little bit more on Kovacs. It's such a, and I don't know if this is something you and Fatima will talk about, but the architecture of it, you have it co-led by WHO, where Dr. Tedros is saying we should look at waivers, and yet clearly there's and I don't think CEPI thinks much about access. So presumably Gavi or others are driving, and I guess less a question, but I think a lot of us have found a lot of frustration with the entire ACT accelerator and with Kovacs particularly, and the limitation of their openness to engagement with civil society and with others. And I'm sure that's something that you all will call out, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about what, I worry a bit about saying, oh, we need more Kovacs and Kovacs to do more of what it's doing, when in fact, it hasn't necessarily stepped up in a way. And I wonder if you all are going to address that.
I think we're going to have to talk about this during the talk, Mitchell. It just, they're not engaging. They're not engaging at all. In fact, they're getting all huffy about, when Fatima was on a IS talk with Seth, very sort of startled that anybody would sort of challenge what they're doing in Geneva with the WHO, with Kovacs, the ACT Accelerator. So yeah, Kovacs should do more because it's the mechanism that's sitting there, but it has to do things better as well. All these institutions, Tedros included, have failed us. And I mean, we should have been prepared for this. Everybody complains the fact that we had no vaccine distribution plan in the US at the end of December. We really had no global distribution plan for the rest of the world, and we still don't. And this is on them. It's not like what we can do. So yeah, I think it's really important to say the institutions have failed us. It's not that they haven't done enough, it's that they're really not open to a partnership and thinking differently than their sort of traditional models.
Do we have other questions or comments for Greg? All these shy HIV activists, unbelievable. Greg, so maybe you sort of covered this with kind of amplifying messages during CROI with the hashtags and things, but what can each of us as individual activists do in our own settings to help amplify this effort and draw attention to what needs to be done?
So I think we really need to put pressure on our own governments, but also the embassies of donor nations in our countries as well. This is, it's deja vu all over again a little bit. We need to do what we did for HIV treatment for COVID vaccines now. And the time frame is enormously compressed, right? There was some idea that, if you're infected with HIV, your progression to disease is described in years. In the context of COVID, it's weeks or months or days. So this is a respiratory infection that the stakes are so much higher. And so I think we just need to turn up the alert level to something that matches the urgency of the situation. And we all have our other sort of actors' priorities. I didn't think about COVID a year ago. I mean, I did a year ago, but I work on HIV and substance use now mostly. And everybody I know around me is working on COVID. And so we're going to need to retool for the next several months to years until we can get sort of a global vaccine access plan online and running, because it's, as I'm watching all the stuff about the variants and the emerging across the country. If we don't deal with vaccination, we don't deal with variants, full stop, right? Evolution is a nasty thing. Lynn is asking that if elderly African Americans are getting vaccinated at lower rates than elderly European Americans in the United States, yes, that's what's happening in every state. Yeah. And Simon said, she's asking also about opening up travel, which Simon had sort of referred to. How are we going to travel in 2021, even if you're vaccinated? Are we going to have vaccination passports? Is that going to be a requirement for immigration or travel to your country? Does that mean that anybody who wants to come to a country that has wide levels of vaccination is not going to be allowed to do so if they come from a country that has low levels of vaccination? There's a whole set of ethical issues that are sort of grotesque when we think about sort of vaccine passports and this other kind of vaccine apartheid, which is going to set a whole set of privileges based on your immunity status, right?
Simon, I see your hand.
Go ahead.
So the issue of travel is completely connected to universal vaccination, either in a country or by country, because because you can see these three last variants, they all happened roughly the same time and they were unconnected. This was just a factor of the virus replicating, and it will continue to replicate and make odd errors. And the survival of the fittest means that the new variants that we get to hear about will be the ones that have transmission advantages or make you more sick. And so if half the world is vaccinated, that section of the world can't travel. You have to have like the lockdown that Australia had, which it could do because it was, it's a large landmass and it controlled its borders. But as soon as travel opened up again, someone will travel, whether or not they're vaccinated or not, you can still be carrying a new variant. And the reason that SARS-2 is a pandemic is because people are infectious before they have symptoms. So there is no real, everything that we're doing is like putting elastoplasts on the dam to keep the water out, because it's just not going to hold. You could even get 80% coverage of your vaccine in a country, but if you have open borders and someone travels from a vaccinated or unvaccinated country with a new variant, all these vaccines it's like setting the clock back. It's like no one's been vaccinated again. And maybe in 6 months' time, there will be a broad coronavirus vaccine that also covers future variants. Maybe that's a year or two away. That's I guess what the solution will be. But then you still have to make sure you had universal access to the vaccine, and it can only be with a cheap vaccine. The Oxford one, AstraZeneca, I think it's about $3 or $4 for a shot. You can't do this with Pfizer charging $50 or $60 for a course.
Yeah, and this raises the issue that Paul did in the chat. What about the Indian, Russian, and Chinese vaccines? Serum Institute has said it can scale up, to quite a large volume. Sputnik and the Russian vaccine also has aspirations of this, but we need to have global cooperation in terms of evaluating these vaccines side to side, right? This is what the sort of global strategic vision that is missing. Who is sort of trying to figure out, from AstraZeneca to the Indian, Russian, and Chinese vaccines, plus all the ones that have been developed in other places in the world, how do they fit into the puzzle? Nobody has sort of articulated this with an operational plan on the other end, saying this is how we're going to scale upwards when needed, and this is how we're going to react to new variants, as Simon is saying. I haven't heard anybody even talk about it, like a universal coronavirus vaccine, with any seriousness, over the past few months, as if that's sort of a global goal that we're all going to work on together, even.
Simon, did you want to say something else? You are on mute.
So the cost issues again. Maybe you could mention these, Craig, because I was on one of the I think it was a WHO webinar where they were talking about, access to resources to distribute vaccines globally requires something like 50 billion. And the US has just borrowed however many trillion, and every other country is borrowing, sums that dwarf 50 billion. So 50 billion should be doable. You could vaccinate the world for $50 billion. And yet I think that the international organizations that are working on this are getting, 5 billion here, 5 billion in a month's time. So they can't plan anything unless it's adequately resourced for the whole program. It sounds like a lot of money, but really, if you think about how much has been spent so far, it's a tiny amount of money. And what you're doing is you're looking for global security.
Yeah, we just passed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill in the US yesterday. So it's totally possible. Mitchell, thanks for the COVID candidate comparison. Is the Serum Institute vaccine in there?
No, actually, it's a good point, because I think the AstraZeneca one that we list there and the pricing is based on AstraZeneca. I'd have to look to my colleagues. I don't think that, actually, the price probably does include the Serum Institute's, but not the Serum Institute's own developed vaccine, the the COVID shield.
Yeah, so What else should I bring up?
Greg, there's a comment or question from Udam again in Chiang Mai. An expert here in Thailand said, even when one was vaccinated before coming to Thailand, that person will still be quarantined for approximately 2 weeks, which is basically against the aim of opening up the country to stimulate the economy. What do you think about this?
I don't know. I mean, the point is that, there's just starting to think about how we should deal with each other in the context of vaccination in the US. If two of us are vaccinated, should we be able to resume activities with each other if one of us is and one of us isn't? What's the ability to transmit virus in the context of a vaccinated person in the context of variants, right? The variance is the fly in the ointment, right? So the point is that, with worldwide vaccination, we should be able to resume our normal activities or close to it. But you can hear in the comment from Udam that the Thai government is worried that it's going to lose control of its domestic pandemic if it even sort of starts to sort of send people who are vaccinated out into the community straight from the airport rather than quarantining for 2 weeks. So all these things are going to be happening over the next few months and years. The other thing is, like, how are you going to know that somebody's vaccinated? Are we going to have like our yellow fever cards that show we were vaccinated? And how easy is it to sort of get your own one sort of on your own if you have a strong urge to travel? There's a whole set of ethical issues here that are not going to be easy to solve.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks, Udam, for the question. We are in the last 10 minutes or so. So do folks have other questions that you'd like to ask verbally or in the chat? And Elaine is just noting that, countries with different policies, it's really going to be challenging. It's just sort of like, the challenge we're having in the States with 50 states all doing their own thing is just amplified how many times more on the global scale when everyone's kind of doing their own thing without any kind of direction.
And Elaine is right. The World Health Organization should have a role in sort of trying to help adjudicate all of this. But, my country's just come back to sort of the table to WHO. So it's just, it's all such a mess.
I was just wondering, Greg, it is such a mess generally, and inequities both across countries, but within countries, as you say. I wonder if is there an example of a vaccination program that you and Fatima might draw on that actually, and I don't know of one, but is there one that shows promise and where there are either, if not success, at least some acknowledgement of how to do it differently and better?
So it's interesting, and it speaks to the resources aren't everything. West Virginia has been pretty successful compared to other US states in getting people vaccinated. One of the poorest states in the US. Lots of other health issues, including HIV and drug use, which I work on. But the US government has sent a lot of doses to private pharmacy chains like CVS and Walgreens. What has happened in West Virginia, for instance, is that they've used lots of mom and pop pharmacies, and mom and pop pharmacies already have relationships with the local nursing homes and lots of the other sort of local institutions. And so it was totally shocking to me that West Virginia would be a vaccine leader, but it is. But it also belies the notion that you need, lots of resources. You need to be a rich California or a rich New York in order to sort of get vaccines up and running. And I'm from one of the richest states in the country, and while we've been good in terms of total vaccinations, we've been terrible in sort of vaccine equity. So
here's a really great question. I think it's a tough. Let's see what you have to say, Greg. Is there any reason for optimism?
Totally. I've been writing articles for The Nation, this lefty American magazine, for the past year. And I think last summer I'm like, we're never gonna have a COVID vaccine. I remember Margaret Heckler saying in 87 or 86, that an AIDS vaccine was around the corner. And so I was like, it is miraculous that we have multiple vaccines at sort of enormous effectiveness in preventing sickness and death, probably transmission, a year out from the sort of emergence of this virus, right? So that makes me optimistic. Trump is gone, makes me optimistic. We got to get rid of Boris Johnson and some others, and then, you know, Bolsonaro. There's a whole bunch of politicians are still in the way around the world. And I'm not kidding when I'm talking about, you know, Bolsonaro and Johnson and others. But, you know, we have the tools now, right? We have the tools we need to do this. It's like, it's no longer like a scientific question. Like we used to say, you can't scream a cure out of a test tube. Well, the vaccines are here. And yeah, we need continuing vaccine development and simpler ones, a universal one, as Simon is saying. You know, we need to, you know, we can't give up on treatment, right? People are still going to get sick and need to be cared for the foreseeable future, and remdesivir doesn't cut it. So I'm optimistic. It's a political challenge now, which means it's about changing people's minds, right? And nobody would have said we could have had millions of people on antiretroviral therapy 20 years ago. They told us it was Africans couldn't tell time, like crazy shit like that, right? And you know, they were doing it the same thing with vaccines, that, you know, the cold chain needed for some of these COVID vaccines is impossible. Then you think about the Ebola vaccine, which was deployed in places which might need the same COVID vaccine now. So I'm totally optimistic. But you know, we're all tired. AIDS activists have been doing this for, you know, 40 years. You know, some of us have been around for most of that time. And it's terrible to think we have to sort of shoulder the burden of another epidemic, but we know how to do it. That's the interesting thing. It's no coincidence that infectious disease researchers, not just have stepped up in clinical ways and in research capacities, but a lot of them have stepped up internationally as leaders, right? And this is the same thing for activists around the world. We know what this is. And we know this is a political crisis, and I feel totally optimistic. We have ways to stop COVID-19 now. 6 months ago, I was despondent. You know, now I'm much more hopeful.
So I think in the final moments, I'm going to ask you a question, Greg. You know, you just really eloquently talked about how the HIV efforts on both the scientific and activism side have really been leading the way in terms of how we address globally COVID. What do you think we can learn from the COVID response and bring back to our work in HIV?
So it's sort of a heavy question, because I started writing about this in the US context last spring, and it's pretty clear that COVID just shows you how sort of entrenched white supremacy is in the United States. You know, we were letting African Americans die of cholera after the Civil War. You know, the history of infectious disease in America is one of sort of deep entrenchment of white supremacy and sort of an apartheid in health that has lived on to this day. Mm-hmm. As I said, the vaccination disparities we've seen, the disparities in death in the United States, also tied to sort of our legacy of white supremacy in the US. And also sort of the Reagan-Thatcher years and the sort of surrender to the market, right? Everything is that the market will provide. Well, the market isn't providing. They're not providing for vaccines. And we sort of had this idea that, you know, that wealth will trickle down, but vaccines will trickle down. You'll eventually get a vaccine, and you'll eventually get some of the largesse that we've had some sort of pillaging the state for the past 40 years. So I think we have to realize that we have deeply entrenched political structures that make people sick, and perpetuated the AIDS epidemic, have made the COVID epidemic worse. You know, a lot of us are like science nerds and want to deal with the sort of technical aspects of these pandemics, but the political aspects of it are deeply tied to what our future is going to be. And I think you just have to fast forward to think of global climate change 20, 30 years from now. It's all tied together in this sort of long arc that we have to sort of address at the same time we're dealing with, you know, our second pandemic.
Thank you, Greg. And we are now at time. I mentioned we have to end early today because Greg and I need to go to the green room and get ready for the opening plenary, for which the Martin Delaney presentation is the very first talk of the opening plenary for CROI. So please, we look forward to seeing you there. We put in the hashtags in the chat. Please help amplify Fatima and Greg's talk, and let's keep this conversation going. I will follow up with a recording to this, a link to a recording to this talk later today, much later today, but you will get it. And we hope to see you at future Breakfast Margarita Clubs tomorrow, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And with that, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all in the plenary very shortly. Ciao.
Great, thanks to see everyone.
Thanks so much.
Everybody.
You'll be great, Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.